Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Embodied Spirituality Podcast. I am your host, Hailey Mitsui, and I'm recording this introduction here exactly 1 week before the 2024 presidential elections. Obviously, there are a lot of other names and positions that are on these ballots that we're going to be voting on in the next week, but I know that the presidential election is weighing heavy over my heart, my spirit, and I imagine it is for some of you too. And so I'm just going to offer you some of the same permission maybe I'm offering myself to just be a little bit easy on yourself. If you can, not schedule yourself too tightly over the next week. If you can, just give yourself a little bit of spaciousness and really reach for any of those sort of grounding tools that you might have. Maybe that is spending time with a pet, or maybe that's getting outside, connecting with friends, making sure you have space and time for your spiritual practices. Whatever it is that helps you connect a little bit deeper with yourself, helps you feel a little bit more integrated into community and place, and oftentimes just a little bit more connected to nature, are all things that are going to help tether you in this time of kind of anticipation, and also kind of on the other side, no matter what the outcome is. So again, just inviting you to be kind with yourself, be generous with your capacity, and tender with yourself as we are in this extremely overwhelming time, not just with the election, but with the ongoing genocide in Gaza and all of the other conflicts and violence that we're inundated with every day when we open our phones and listen to the news. And so, on that note, I'd love to invite us just into taking a few breaths together. Sometimes when I notice my mind or my anxiety starting to spiral, I just come back to my breath. So I invite you to return to your breath. Just really noticing the next 1 or 2 inhales and exhales. All right. Thanks, everyone. Today, I'm joined by my dear friend, Leonetta Elaiho. She is a creative contemplative, and I'm just excited to share this conversation with you. So, Leonetta, welcome to the podcast. Yay.
Thank you, Hailey. Excited to be here.
So excited to have this conversation. But before we kick things off, I would love to for you to just introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners, who you are, how you're arriving today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hailey. I'm so excited to be here with you. You've been somebody that I think I met your website first and I was like, oh my God, person I need to know. Beautiful website, speaking all my language, saying all the things. So super excited to be here with your audience today. Leonetta Elaiho, I consider myself a creative contemplative. I'm an aesthete. I'm a big believer in beauty and its power to heal and to change us. I'm a spiritual companion. I hold space for people on their spiritual journeys. I'm a mom. I'm a sister. I like to think I'm a good friend. I'm a taco and cupcake lover. Had one yesterday, cupcake, not a taco, even though yesterday was Taco Tuesday.
Amazing.
And that's me.
This podcast is kind of, the whole idea is having conversations with folks who are deconstructing, reconstructing, expanding their spirituality, and maybe feel a little bit alone in that journey. And what we're doing here is not even necessarily offering tips and tricks and advice as much as just witnessing each other's journeys and trusting that in that witnessing there's some mirroring or even some inspiration, or things kind of flicker alive in us in a new way, or feel kind of seen and witnessed in a new way. You can go into as little or as much detail as you want, but what would you sort of consider as maybe that starting point of your spirituality or your spiritual journey?
Yeah, I grew up in a faith-filled household. We went to a Pentecostal church, and the Pentecostal church I went from being kind of drug there against my will as a child to probably around late middle school, having kind of a spiritual experience where I gave my life to Christ in a very dramatic fashion, got saved, spoke in tongues, and was full on in.
Good for you.
Right? I did all the things. And I became, to be serious about your faith at that point was to be seriously committed to the work of ministry. And so I became a little Christian worker bee. I was probably within a short amount of time, I was leading what was the youth ministry, which back in the day was called the young people's the young people's ministry. So I was leading the young people's ministry. I was teaching Sunday school. My commitment to God was worked out through service and doing. And in that particular Christian context, it was very much you showed your faithfulness and your seriousness to your faith by the service that you did and the amount of sacrifice and time and showing up. It was very much the gravitational pull of the spiritual center was inside the four walls of the church, right? And so that was a big part of my early formation, both culturally, I think before it was really personal to me. And then when it became personal, it became like I became super Christian in terms of my commitment to doing and how I showed up.
That feels familiar. That definitely feels familiar to me as well. And is that, so was there something in particular that shifted that sort of worker bee mentality? Or is that, was that kind of where you were for a while or where you still are?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, nope, not still there. I think I'd probably be dead. still working that hard for Jesus at this point. But no, I think, Hailey, it's like life expands us, right? So for me, I graduated college. I was still very committed to worker bee Christendom. And I also want to say this, because I think sometimes when we evolve past the places where we've been, there's a little bit of poo-pooing. And so even as I think about the times, my worker bee season, right? Like I learned so much, like service, leadership, sacrifice. Like I cleaned the toilets in the church before on Saturday nights before Sunday morning. I mean, there's just was a call to service that I actually think has been foundational to where I've gone since. And I can say that about every different Christian or spiritual space that I have evolved into and out of or through. So that was no different. So worker bee season of life got expanded because I graduated college and I started working for a Christian ministry that really had this approach of incarnational ministry. So instead of this gravitational pull inside of the four walls of church, bring people to church, be at church all the time, it was how do we be in the neighborhood? How do we be in community? What does God with skin look like out and about? And that was at the time, that was this, oh my gosh, this is right. We got to get out there. And so that began to shift kind of my spiritual orientation to the neighborhood. And then being in the neighborhood and doing ministry and outreach work and social service work, working with young people in schools, all still with the eye of there was a little bit of like, I'm going to meet you outside so I can get you inside to church. And I think working through that and then realizing, okay, actually, God is actually here in these spaces where I'm showing up thinking, oh, I'm going here to get you over here so that we can meet God inside the four walls of this church. So that I think over time, as I started to have experiences and transformational experiences with God in neighborhood and seeing like, oh, actually, God dwells and resides in these spaces and places that we have thought historically where God would not be. And so I think marrying that with some theology and some teaching that came from authors, it came from my experience working at Christian organizations that had a much more progressive and inclusive theology that really challenged me to become a bit more inclusive. And then from there, I think even further evolutions of interacting with the spiritual needs of, at the time, I was really focused on young people in community, with the reality of community needs themselves, that young people giving their life to Christ didn't fundamentally change the social injustices that they were facing every day in the community and neighborhood. And so what was a theology that was liberating and actually thinking about systems change? What was the voice in the gospel that I was hearing that was revolutionary and thinking about how do communities change to experience the fullness of God and the kingdom of God and beloved community. And that also led me on a different path. So all that to say, again, to this point of, I like evolution and versus deconstruction. I think certainly like there are things that there are some of us who have had like really painful, traumatizing experiences in the church where we really do need to deconstruct some of that shit. Like, take it. Can I cuss on this podcast? I'm sorry.
Please do.
My bad.
Please do.
Sorry, listeners. But, there are some things that we need to like completely separate from and break down. But to the point of constant evolution. And I love the frame that you have for this podcast of like, how do we not just leave ourselves in a deconstructed state, but what are we looking at to rebuild? And that evolution, I feel like, is constant. It happens in all things. And so even in the breaking down of like from my Pentecostal roots to my, first blush incarnational work that was like, I'm going to meet you there to bring you here, to wow, God is here, to wow, God is here. And, God has work that God has work that they want to do in this space, has just been a beautiful evolution for me in my faith and in my ministry work.
Evolution is a really beautiful word for it. At least that evokes in me a following of like the path of growth and life in a way. Evolution from a biological standpoint being that what are these adaptations that end up being more supportive to like our life form? And so when I think of evolution with spirituality, it's like, what are these adaptations and changes that are more supportive to my understanding of the divine? I want to go back a little bit to something you said, because I feel like you glossed over it, and I'm like, but that is so hard, which was this temptation or this tendency to kind of poo-poo the lower level of evolution that we might have been. I shouldn't even use lower. And for those that are just listening, I did use air quotes. It's like, we sort of, we evolved beyond a certain point and look back and are like, oh my God, everyone that thinks that's so dumb. We have this sort of air about it. But my experience is that attitude is really based in shame, because we're embarrassed about that. We used to think that, or we're shameful that we hurt people when we were in that season and we held those certain beliefs. And so we look down on it, but it's really us like looking down on that version of ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how have you managed to, or how have you navigated that self-compassion for those past versions of you that now you don't necessarily see the same way? And or how have you, sorry, this is a really long question, so answer whatever part you feel compelled to.
That's a good one.
How have you held compassion towards yourself and towards others that are in different places that maybe you inhabited, but now you don't anymore?
Oof, this is such a good question. And I'm going to speak to it, but I don't think I have a good answer to it. The best way I can explain it is you can't embrace and include all of yourself nor others until you get to the point where you can. That's the best way that I can say it. So, for example, what I would say, I'd even take it a step farther and go, if you are evolving in your spirituality and you have arrived at a point where you are still poo-pooing what was before, keep going. Keep going, because there is more to come. I think what I realized, there was a point where I realized I had come upon the spirituality that was expansive enough to hold me for the rest of my life, is when I got there and I was like, everything before this belongs. There wasn't a sense of, oh, now I'm here. Oh, gosh, I can't believe I was in this space before. Oh, gosh, now I'm here. Oh, yeah, I wasn't evolved enough there. I got to a point in my spirituality, a depth of my spirituality, and when I say get there, I mean just like getting to the outer edges that I am going to be swimming here for the rest of my life trying to figure this all out, right? Yeah. But what was clear to me when I got into these new waters, when I drilled down deep enough, as Richard Rohr would like to say, there's a point where you drill down deep enough of the well of any spirituality and you hit an expanse that is broad, and you go and you look around and you're like, oh, everything belongs here. It's not just my chute, right? So when I began to swim in those waters and realize, oh, I have had judgment of my Pentecostal day self, of my fiery, evangelical, incarnational ministry self, of my judgmental, overly zealous, social justice warrior, liberation theology self, that now I'm like, oh, I can see the beauty, I can see the truth, I can see the goodness in all of those things. And I can go back and think about my Pentecostal days and think about the church mothers who were there when I was in the church, who are still there, who pray fiercely every Wednesday night, who may not have, the resources, and they're never going to go on a living school contemplative journey. They're never going to go on a Joshua Tree spiritual retreat, but they're going to be in there praying till they are sweating, asking God to heal their family members, to, feed the hungry, to keep the doors of the church open so that people will come, and seeing the beauty in that and going, it doesn't matter if they ever evolve. Like, God is with them there, that God is with, all of us in the different spaces of our journey. And that whatever, Brian McLaren has a way of saying this that I'm not going to think of, but just that kind of spiritual posture, that whatever the depth and full devotion and commitment looks like in that spiritual posture, that's enough, that God will meet you there. And I feel like getting to the expanse and having a more gracious, I wish I had a rubric to say how I got there. All I know is I stayed with it long enough that the grace found me to get to a point and be like, oh, wow, there's beauty all around. There's grace all around here. There's goodness all around here. I don't have to reject something to embrace something new, that everything truly can belong. So
as you're saying that, like, I feel that in my heart center, like the contentment and the rest that we can experience from that place of belonging. And then I also hear in my head, which, good, bad, or other, it's like the heart is like, oh yeah. And then I hear my head being like, but what about all the harm that those earlier stages, or that those other parts, like, inflict? How do we hold that in the everything belongs? I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer, but I don't know, how do you interact with that, saying yes to what is, even as it causes, continues to cause harm?
Yeah. Well, and it's like, what is the origin of the harm, right? Like, the harm the system? Is the harm the church building? Is the harm ideologies? And those ideologies, I mean, even in spaces, ministries, right? I feel like we've seen this culturally in so many, the fall, the demise of so many progressive Christian spiritual spaces where, like, that ideology is still, it exists in the human psyche. So if there's anything to deconstruct, which takes constant tending, it's what are the ways that we are finding ourselves subject to the forces of capitalism, to mismanagement of resources, as seeing ourselves as above a deeper and greater value of another. Like, that's persistent across all. And so I think of the harm as like an offshoot of that somehow in some systems can lodge itself really deeply and become embedded in the infrastructure, and then it feeds itself and grows. But at the end of the day, like, you can take away that system. We can say, oh, it's evangelical Christianity, or it's Pentecostal charism, or it's, whatever other thing. But what is the heart and spirit of us as individuals that can carry from, that space to even liberation theology movement work, right? I think there's still so much opportunity for us to face our own our own souls and the ways that our attachments have been co-opted by culture that's not great, and to do the personal self-work, to detach from that, to do that work in safe, loving community where there's forgiveness and healing and love. I don't know how we solve for the harm, but I do know that the harm is ideological and that it's not embedded in any one unique framework. Even in the most expansive, inclusive spiritual spaces, I think this is why these spaces and conversations for BIPOC, queer folks that often are marginalized are different than inclusive spaces for predominantly white folks, right? There are things that maybe aren't coming to the surface that we're not seeing in our own heart and psyche about the ways that we still exclude, the ways that we still judge. And I don't think that falls on institutional lines or even racial lines or gender lines. I think it is a condition of our heart and soul, and all of us have to be willing to interrogate and deconstruct all of what this culture and society puts upon us, to really take an honest look at what is in us, embedded in all of us, that leads to harm.
Leonetta, that's so good. Because what I hear you saying is like, there is like a soul wound from our alignments. And when I say ours, I'm thinking Western society, American colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism. But there's this soul wound that comes from aligning oneself, or even being baked in a culture of injustice, of colonization, of white supremacy, of capitalism. And that regardless of what infrastructure or belief system, if it's coming from an unhealed place, it's going to result in harm, is what I'm hearing you say. And how do we fix those systems? Don't know, but I hear you calling us back to mending our own soul wound. Not that we will ever be clear of causing harm. We all are going to cause harm intentionally or unintentionally at some point, but this calling for people to come back to this place of belonging and connectedness, and birth systems or institutions or whatever. I don't know. Anytime something becomes institutionalized, it kind of gets fucked up. But like what I hear you saying is it's like this inside out versus like the outside in, maybe.
That's right. Just addressing all the othering, right, that happens at all levels. It's the same thing that we were just talking about with the spiritual journey of getting to a less judgmental posture. I mean, the same is true in any aspect of our lives. How do we get to a point where we don't see our fiercest enemy or opponent? How do we not see them as completely other, but we can see, we have fierce disagreement on these things. There are things here that that are fundamentally fractured. But like the minute that I diminish you and make you less than human, that make you less than beloved of God, harm is going to happen. It's going to happen in my heart. It's going to happen at some point in how I speak about you. It's going to happen in the jokes I make about you. So attending to our own tendency to other for all the beautiful and challenging realities that are among us feels key.
I have like a petty question for you that maybe we'll keep in, maybe we'll edit out. But as you were talking, I'm like, oh man, do you ever get angry or frustrated when you see like white men coming out of spaces that you've come out of, like so angry and bitter, and you're like, dude, if I can do it, I had it like 1,000 times worse than you, and if I can do it and be like hold it, like you can do it. Like, I don't know. There's just something about, like, sometimes I feel like those are the, like, folks that even, and maybe it's just the jarringness of it, but folks that, like, held the most power when systems stopped working for them, it's even harder for them to rebuild, where maybe those of us where the system never really worked for us in the first place, we're like, what's new?
What is freaking new, right? Yeah. As Howard Thurman would say, those of us who have had our backs against the wall, right? Yeah. Those of us exist on the edge of the inside, right? Yeah. Like our orientation is to overcome and persevere through the struggle. So yes, the tenderness of dominant culture identities and their own. I think honestly, and I might get eviscerated for this by your listeners, but I feel like I see this a lot in feminist movement work from white women, right? Like there's just the tenderness and the fragility of how dare patriarchy come after us. That just is fascinating to me. I feel like Barbie was like such a, I don't know what you thought about that movie. I could have taken those.
Speak freely.
I could have taken those 2 hours back of my life back personally. But I think it was fascinating to see the culture go, wow, what an incredible like interrogation of like, you know, patriarchy and feminism and this mantra and this speech. And I was just like, oh, was that novel? Like, was that like, oh, okay. And I just realized, oh, for so many people, they're not living in the reality of those things in a way where vocalizing them and talking about them and expressing them in community is not the norm. Right. Which actually gave me a little bit of like grace for that community. I was like, oh, that was not that moving for me. That was not that revelatory or, you know, it didn't point to a new expansive idea to have a woman call out these dichotomies that she's having to navigate. Like, oh, okay. Yeah. Like that's part of the experience. I feel like navigating and not for all people of color, but certainly for a lot of us, you know, that to your point, it's kind of like, well, these are the skills that you have when you are existing on the edge, you know, your back is against the wall as you wear many different identities. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I actually remember having a very similar reaction response to that. I think I'm thinking of the same scene where it's like, you got to do this, but you have to do this, and you have to do that. Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, to have it laundry listed out, you're like, yeah, it does kind of fucking suck to be a woman sometimes. But again, this isn't news.
True.
This isn't news to me. To have to hold these dichotomies. Yeah. But I've always felt like one of the greatest is not the right word, but like effective tools of patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism is the illusion of isolation, is isolating people in our single family homes, behind our fences, you know, these nuclear families. And so many people of other cultures, you know, we have this more, everyone's an auntie, everyone's a cousin. We have this more interconnectedness that allows for these sharing and storytelling and witnessing, even what we're just doing here, witnessing our journeys, that it is almost heartbreaking that speech was so witnessing for so many women who had never had their experience validated before. Yeah. That is like, you said, I think it was a little, you know, kind of odd, and also built empathy for like, this is the first time you're hearing your struggle like reflected back to you. Yeah. Wow, that kind of sucks, you know? Yeah. I mean, good, but also, wow. That's sad.
Yeah, well said. I agree. That's exactly what it was.
This kind of brings me to a question that I've asked a few folks. I've been meaning to ask like everyone, but sometimes it just doesn't kind of come up in conversation. Since we're touching on sort of the maybe the resilience or the collective togetherness that we have access to when we're a part of more collective cultures and communities. And, you know, there are plenty of white folks that have that too. It doesn't have to be racialized, but most often they are more marginalized communities that have to interdepend on each other more than folks that have like access to more economic resources. And I'm kind of curious how, if at all, your identities and whatever, all of the many identities that you hold, like how has that impacted your spiritual journey?
It's a beautiful question. So my identities, I think I'm Black, I'm cisgendered, heterosexual, middle class, ish.
Yeah, whatever that means anymore.
Exactly. Maybe I can pay my bills this month.
Yeah.
Cool. Maybe I'll flip it and say it this way. I think probably what informs my spirituality more than those identities as a starting point is my social proximity, right? What am I proximate to? What are the challenges, the conversations, the people that I feel closest to? Now, my identities, because of a whole lot of isms, actually thrust me in proximate nature to people who often are backs against the wall, edge of the inside. But that's not a given. It's not my identities alone, right? Because there are probably plenty of Black, femme, cisgender, heterosexual people that are can exist very cozily in some different spaces than me and have their spirituality be very different than mine. You know, I think the group that's probably shaped a lot of my spirituality more recently has been queer Black femmes. And I think about the ways that being proximate to those communities that don't share all identities with, but to see the kinship, the love, the care, the commitment to social and communal progress, that has made me thirst and desire a spirituality that is very much informs who I want to be and how I want to live into my faith. I think about a lot of the work that I do around social justice and supporting social justice leaders and their well-being. And it's very clear to me, being proximate to these communities, that our democracy is held together by women, femme, queer, Black and brown leaders who are putting their bodies, their hearts on the front lines. Not exclusively so. There's certainly many others joining in that fight, but just being proximate to those communities has certainly shaped and expanded my sense of what a spirituality that heals, that is inclusive, that's revolutionary, that's transformative, what it looks like. So I would say it's not that my identities don't matter. They do. They matter to the degree they allow me to be more proximate to communities and to lean into communities that are wrestling with a number of different social challenges and isolation, as you spoke about, that just allow a distinct viewpoint on the divine and how the divine is transforming our world, our communities, their lives, which has just been like good medicine for me.
I appreciate that reframing or that combining of how our identities, that our identities often inform the communities and spaces that we are allowed or invited into, and how those are the places. It's less like, oh, these are the identities I hold, and more the access to the proximity, I think you used, that feel like they're really shaping and forming your spirituality and your continued evolution. I'm curious, kind of at this point in your spiritual journey and spiritual evolution, like, what do spiritual practices look like for you? Or do you have any particular practices that feel really supportive to you in this season?
You know, I mentioned like beauty is so important to me. Creativity is so important to me. Gazing has been a big invitational spiritual practice to me. Like, I love to look upon a thing, right? And I think there's something so awkward in our culture where even just like holding each other's gaze for a long time can just be so uncomfortable for most of us. But whenever I find a friend who's like, are you willing to do this with me? I'm just like, let us see into the window of each other's souls and just hold that space. So I love that with people, but I also love to like watch a spider weave a web, to watch a flower. You know, I was at Bellevue Botanical Gardens a few weeks ago, and I just went around with my little iPhone and just, if there was a thing that stood out to me, I took pictures of it. And then at the end, I was looking at the pictures that spoke to me, and they were all like these buds, or like a fern that was still really tightly coiled, or a peony that's just like so tightly bound. It's not just on the cusp of like this explosion of softness, but at the moment it's just so tight in the bud. And it was like all of these things that are just about to move into this blossoming. And it felt like, oh, I felt like the Spirit's word to me was, that's you. That's me. I'm just there. And I'm a 4 on the Enneagram. Like I'm an INFJ. Like, I feel all the feels. It's never quite enough. I'm always on the precipice. And then I just felt the Spirit say, and just like the peony, it's going to bloom and then it's just going to fall away. This process will start again, right? It's just this reminder of the constant evolution, right? That as much as I want to hang on to like, what's the thing? What's the explosive moment of beauty and greatness that I've arrived to? And yes, that will happen, and it's going to happen again and again and again, and then it's going to fall away and die, and then something else will come, and you'll go through the winter and the all that to say, spiritual practice for me is just trying to awaken myself to like the messages that are always around. I do a lot of that with walking with friends. You and I took a walk the other day, and
I know this girl has a Calendly link just to schedule walks around Seward Park. Like, that's how serious you are about your walking. I love that so much.
I love it because I just love a good soul friend, right? When you can just show a little part of yourself and they show a little part of themselves. Like Howard Thurman says, it's like when the sound of the genuine, when you can hear it in yourself, it goes down in you and then it can come up in the other person and you can see yourself reflected in them because the sound of the genuine plays the same music. Right? Like that's a spiritual practice for me. Like I want to hear the sound of the genuine that plays the same music in you and me and other people. So that's been a practice. I still struggle with my like contemplative time every morning, but it's like the one thing that I know will help me stay in my center all day. Yet it's the hardest thing to make happen because it's just all the things. So I'm probably about a 50% rate, but
hey,
I aspire.
That's impressive.
I aspire. So.
Is it like centering prayer? Is that your practice or?
Yeah, it's kind of centering prayer. I mean, I don't know. It's like all these things have different names. It's like centering prayer, contemplative, transcendental meditation. I mean, I sit in silence and I try not to let my mind drive me forward. I do, which is a very Thomas Keating centering prayer practice, try to have a word. 90% of the time, my word is present. And I breathe it in and I breathe it out. And I just try for 20 some odd minutes to just be present to that moment, sometimes with greater success than others. But yeah, I'm guessing it's probably, centering prayer, but meditation practice, contemplative practice, miscellaneous contemplative practice.
I mean, right. Contemplation can mean a million things, but that kind of silence and stillness, solitude. Yeah. And I'm hearing there's that beautiful range. There's this silence, stillness, solitude. There's gazing into beloved people's eyes. There's walking with friends. There's being with nature. So a lovely mixture of sort of, of solitude and togetherness. What's really.
What about for you? Can I ask you questions on the podcast?
Yeah.
What is most like giving you life in terms of practice these days?
Nature really is like my primary teacher right now, as well as my own body. I mean, I think I'm just finishing my somatic therapy certificate, and so I know I'm so excited. But that is obviously so embodied, and so much connection to the self, which has really, it's not a spiritual program at all, but has been very, very spiritual for me. Yeah. And I see, kind of my own body and being and nature as my primary teachers right now. I think, again, we've referenced Richard Rohr a lot. Leonetta and I both did a program out in New Mexico called the Living School, and which is kind of a training, a program around kind of contemplative
curriculum
Christian.
of your life.
Yeah, curriculum of your life. I don't know. And Richard Rohr was one of the primary teachers, but I think in that setting is when I heard him say like that creation is the first Bible, is the first sacred text, and that gave me so much permission, because I think when I heard that for the first time, I was still pretty in my Christian box. I don't know. I don't think I could put myself in a box anymore. Christianity's somewhere in there, but I'm definitely not squarely in that anymore. But at the time I was, and that was so liberating, because I needed someone to give myself permission to see sacred text as more expansive than just the Bible. And so, time in nature. Sometimes I will have a conversation with a tree, or, sit and just try to notice my surroundings. And I think without fail, there is a life lesson. There is like spiritual nourishment that comes from watching a bee, on a flower, or noticing how nature is interconnected and interdependent, or just the stillness of sitting in the shade that's provided by these beautiful trees we're surrounded by in the Pacific Northwest. Like, that feels like my nourishment in this season.
Beautiful. I'm really excited to hear more about your somatic work as it more fully expresses itself. Just the thought of like your body as a site of spiritual practice just feels so good. So I'm excited to hear
really good. Actually, in this cohort that I'm doing a How to Rebuild cohort, and a participant said their body was their sacred text, and I just thought that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And it just, and those things you hear where it's like, I already thought that, but I hadn't named it that way before. And so that, I think there's a lot there.
There's a lot there. Text. That's a whole podcast episode. I mean, you talk about all the deconstructing ideas against, especially as a femme body and purity culture and everything else, to let go of. To embrace the divine within us and to consider our bodies as a sacred text. Oh. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I agree.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so much for spending this time and sharing your journey and allowing not just me to witness it, but all the other folks that are going to come across it at some point. I really trust that the people that need to witness and be witnessed by this conversation will be in some way. But how can people find you or connect to you and the work that you're doing in the world if you want them to?
Find me, friends. Find me. I am writing more, not as much, but writing more of a newsletter that I hope to relaunch very soon. I practice spiritual companionship, so if folks are looking for a spiritual companion, they can find me at Beautifulle, which is the word beautiful and then an extra L and E. So beautiful, L-E. Beautifulle is how you pronounce it. .com is my website. You can reach out to me there. If you're looking for nonprofit or philanthropic consulting, healing circle work, retreat facilitation, you can find me there as well. All those things are part of my purview these days, but really grateful to you, Hailey. Thank you for all the amazing work that you do in the world. We are kindred spirits, and I'm just so grateful that you're creating this space for all of us as we continue to evolve, deconstruct, whatever you want to call it, dismantle, rebuild, reconnect with the divine in ourselves and have it, embrace our own agency in it. So thank you for the conversation too.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Embodied Spirituality Podcast. I would love to invite you to like, subscribe, rate, leave a comment wherever it is that you listen to this podcast, whatever platform is your preferred platform. It does go a long way in ensuring the sustainability of this show. If you want to learn more about my work as a somatic coach or a spiritual director, you can go to HaileyMitsui.com. That's HaileyMitsui.com, and learn more about my work, my programming, and how we might be able to partner together in the future. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.